Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. And today we're going to be talking once again about one of the most harmful yet pervasive narratives in the criminal legal system and how a new effort in Oregon is seeking to confront it. So when we talk about humans are complicated and human problems are complicated. And it is very, very tempting for systems like the criminal legal system to try to make things simple by putting people into boxes. So like most people, like prosecutors for that matter, you might be tempted to think about, the system where there are perpetrators of crime and there are victims or survivors of crime. And these are totally separate people, have nothing to do with one another. That's a convenient view. It's easy. It's tempting. But let's be real. This idea that there are good people and bad people and we know who they are is not real. It's tempting, but false. And the truth is that the actuality of who we encounter in the criminal legal system, who is causing harm, who is experiencing harm, is far, far, far more complicated. So today's survivor may be tomorrow's perpetrator. And that's something that the state of Oregon, criminal legal system in that state, is trying very, very hard to confront right now. This pertains with particular intensity to women. So when we look at people who are incarcerated, we look at women who are incarcerated, nearly half of all incarcerated women are in fact survivors of physical or sexual violence. And among the 230,000 incarcerated women and girls in the United States, at least 30% of those serving time on murder or manslaughter charges were protecting themselves or a loved one at the time they committed that crime. This is just the tip of the iceberg, though, when we factor in all of the ways in which people are coerced into doing things they would not otherwise do. There's a lot of charges that fall on women and girls for smuggling, drug trafficking, other forms of nonviolent crime that come back to coercion by someone who has been abusive. As a public defender, I have myself tried to, on multiple occasions, stop prosecutors from incarcerating people I represented who had themselves survived unimaginable trauma and whose current actions were a direct result of that trauma. But for far too long, the criminal legal system has ignored this reality, choosing instead to try to separate people into convenient boxes. But a new bill in Oregon would seek to confront this dynamic by granting courts the ability to shorten sentences for people who are survivors of domestic violence when that domestic violence was a contributing factor to the crime, and when the presumptive or mandatory sentence would be unduly harsh. In other words, when the sentence on the books would be way too harsh in light of what someone has experienced, judges would have the right to consider the reality of the experience in handing out a sentence. Additionally, the bill would allow survivors of domestic violence who are currently incarcerated to petition for resentencing. So this could help people not go into the system, and it could help bring people home. Now, for more on this, we spoke last week to some legislators involved, but now we're very excited to be joined by Natasha Wilson, who is an advocate with some personal experience that goes to the heart of this bill. Her mother, Debbie Piegler, was sentenced to life in prison for the death of her husband. Natasha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So before we delve into talking about the law and what it would do, I really want our viewers to have a chance to understand the real world experience of what things are like without this law. You have experienced this damage, harm, pain of this system firsthand. Can you talk through what happened to your mom?
Yes, I experienced it. My mom was abused by my father. She was sentenced, not only abused, she was forced into prostitution. She went to the authorities for help. She went to everybody she knew for help, with nowhere to go, nothing, no one would help her, nothing to do, nothing else to do, just nowhere else to go. She did what everybody felt like she would need to do. She asked someone to help, which resulted in the death of my father. It was my mother and my father. I hear people talk about my father as if he's the victim. My mother was the victim. She was sentenced to life in prison. She served 27 years. This this law would have kept her out of prison. This law would have helped her in so many ways. Um, so now we're trying to help other women now, that will. It's hard. I am a child who lost both my mother and my father. We're trying to help other children from losing their parents. This domestic is so many people that have been victimized from domestic violence, and just need a little help. They need the legal system to help them. That's what this law would help. That's what having this domestic violence. That's what having this in place would do. It would help these parents, these women that's in prison for decades, that felt like they didn't have any other choice. Now you can come back to the parole board and help. Somebody would listen. Now they have something in place that they can kind of go back and say, hey, mom, hey, there's something in place that explains what happened to me. I was a victim now.
Ask you just
It's
quickly about the way things are right now, because what you just described is a world in which you as a child were witnessing violence in your home, and
yes,
you knew, it sounds to me like you very clearly knew what was happening between your
absolutely.
parents. But when the time came when your mother was accused, she didn't have the same chance to explain to the judge the reality of the situation, or the judge couldn't consider it. Is that what happened? The judge wasn't allowed to consider the violence that your mom experienced?
Absolutely. It wasn't even, my mother was forced into a plea, but it wasn't even an option. Domestic violence wasn't even an option. That wasn't even taken into consideration what she had been through, even though it was plenty of documentations that was, she had been to the police station. It was plenty of reports of abuse that was already in place prior to the death. None of that was taken in consideration at all during the hearing, at all.
So I have to ask, you know, I'm a former public defender, so I have a little bit of like a dim view of prosecutors sometimes. But I try
Hmm.
to be gentle and fair, and extend grace and assume everybody wants the best in the system. But I guess what I can't identify with is, there was a prosecutor in your mom's case whose job it is to do justice and to find the right outcome. Were they also not interested in hearing what your mom had been through? And did they give any reason why?
No, we've gotten over 1,000 members kicked off of our case that just didn't do the correct things with our case. Just, it's like nobody wanted to hear why. Nobody wanted to identify her as a victim. Like nobody wanted to take in consideration what had happened and what my mom had been through. Everybody just wanted to classify him as he was murdered. Like it was no reason why. Like it was just, she just murdered this man and she's a cold hard killer for no reason at all. My mother had never even had a traffic ticket prior. Never had a ticket, never, she was a straight A student. She was just an honor, just an amazing person. Period. Um, Never had anything. He had went to jail. Matter of fact, he had went to jail. She went to the police station and got him arrested the night before. Prior, tried to get help the night before. He had got killed, and they didn't take any of that in consideration when she got incarcerated for it.
So now that your mom has done so many years in prison, what has she told you about the women around her? I mean, just knowing the numbers on how many women in prison have had similar experiences or have ended up in prison because of abuse, coercion, control. What does your mom tell you about what other women have experienced who are in there with her?
She just said that, she's not alone. She basically has said that, you know, what she went through wasn't in vain. She said if her story can help somebody else, what she went through was not in vain. And she knew what she had to go through was to help other people. And I didn't understand it at all at the time. Me being a kid, just not having my mom, we didn't understand it. As she was in prison for 27 years, it is multiple women that we have went through. We have met. My mom have wrote us, especially even with this movie Crime After Crime. It is so many women that have came up to these screenings to me and said, I'm so glad this film is out because your mom is not alone. I went through this. My daughter is in the prison now. I met a lot of women. We had a law like this passed that was in Jersey and New York. We went into the prisons and met with women that was incarcerated with domestic violence as well. So it's a lot of women out there. Unfortunately, everybody have this story in their life time. Just people not allowed to talk about it. And now you having more women that's able to talk about it and not afraid. You're having the courage to speak out about it. And now we're able to help. So it's still a lot of women out that needs this law, that needs help.
So let's talk about the law. And before we do, I just want to clarify. I understand your mom passed away.
Yes.
I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah.
Did she get to know a little bit of the advocacy and organizing that was happening around this issue before she passed?
Yes, she did.
Okay.
She absolutely did.
So let's talk about that legacy then. HB 2825. I'm going to say that real loud for viewers in Oregon who want to follow this law. HB 2825. As I understand it, would not just apply to women who are accused right now, but would also help bring more women home from prison. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about how that bill would work?
Absolutely. So a lot of the women that's going to be, like she said, will bring women home. So some of the women that's now eligible for parole now can kind of go up with this law. If it's passed, it's needed. It's needed because now they're able to go up to the parole with this law that if they can say if they have evidence in their case that states that their trial or their case was that proves that their case was a domestic violence situation case, they can be eligible for parole. The judge can use that when sentencing, when going up for parole now. And if they're even with new sentencing, if they have this evidence in place now, when judge is going to sentencing, they can use that in sentencing. That's something that evidence was never, ever, ever taken in place. We didn't have that with my mom's case. That's something that was just dismissed. That would just make a huge difference in a lot of people's case.
Talk about those people. As you described to me, I'm hesitating because to me this is like so morally sensible and it does not feel at all extreme. Like no, knowing about the horrible trauma that someone experienced that brought them to where they are seems like something anyone in the legal system would want to know about. But I understand that the Oregon District Attorneys Association has actually come out against this bill and that they claim they are speaking for victims when they oppose this law. What's your response to that? What would you want to say to prosecutors who are against this law?
I don't understand why. If you're speaking for people that is for this law, if you're speaking for the people of Oregon, why will you be opposed to a law that protects people? This is a law that's only going to protect somebody that's been harmed. It's no way to hurt it. No, it's no way this law will hurt someone. So why would you be opposed to it? I don't understand it. Only way you would be opposed to a law like this is if you're not really there trying to protect the people from Oregon.
You know, there is actually polling that backs you up. There was a recent poll from Data for Progress in collaboration with the Lab, which is a project of the appeal, that found that 70% of likely voters, and that was like across the board, across ideology, across political parties, they all agree, 70% of voters, solid majorities of every party affiliation, support new laws that would let courts take this information into consideration and hand out shorter sentences, including for people who are already in prison. So 70% is a pretty sizable majority. And I'm just wondering, you know, as you organize in your community, as you talk to people, are you feeling that? Like, does that reflect your experience organizing around this bill?
I'm not going to say yes, and I'm not going to say no. I'm going to say I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that Oregon is going to do the right thing. And that's what I want to believe, that, you know, everybody's going to do the right thing. So I'm just going to say I'm hopeful that that 70% will grow and we'll get to where we need to be.
So with that in mind, as we close the show, is there anything you want to say to people who might be watching this, who might be on the fence about whether they want to call their legislator or anything like that? Is there any message you have for people in your community or around the country about this issue?
Just call your legislator. Please put this on the boards. We need this. Oregon needs this. There's a mother, there's a daughter who's waiting for her mother to come home, like me. There's sisters, there's a family member, this is just needed. Please call your legislator. Please get this on the board any way you can. It's needed.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much, Natasha Wilson, for coming, for speaking about your mother, for speaking out on this issue. Thank you for telling your story and for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want to reflect on the words that Natasha Wilson just left us with here, saying how she doesn't know how anyone could oppose the idea that if a person is accused of a crime because they were terribly abused and they want to talk about the factors leading up to how they came to sit in that chair, how they came to be in that defendant's chair, that judges should have the right to hear about it, that the person should have a right to have that information considered. We heard a little bit of trepidation in Natasha Wilson's voice. She clearly is very eager to have more support on the ground in changing this law and allowing a second chance for, as she put it, those mothers who want to come home to their daughters, and for the daughters and sisters and siblings who want to have their mothers and loved ones home. So this has been another episode of The Appeal Live. Thank you so much for joining us, for listening to Natasha. You can find us here on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm Emily Galvan Almanza, and we'll see you again soon.